Hey Naomi, thank you for coming. I know you are very busy and it's a weekend, so I appreciate you creating the time.
No problem, Gladys. Always great to catch up with an old friend.
Excellent. We will talk about, I was excited to have you, or I've always wanted to have you here so that we talk about nuclear engineering, nuclear science, nuclear fusion. What the heck is that? It sounds so scary. I mean, I'm from engineering, but still, when you talk about nuclear, it just sounds nuclear. So we'll talk about nuclear fusion or nuclear and what you do. How did you get there? You will tell us about your grad school journey. I was watching a random video from the internet. I don't know if you still remember, but you were giving tips to US Rhodes scholars because you're a US Rhodes scholar, and we will talk about that as well towards the end. But let's begin from what you currently do. What is nuclear fusion and what are you currently doing with it?
Yeah, so thanks again for having me on. So I work in nuclear fusion, and when people first hear the word nuclear, they immediately think of bombs. So I usually have to kind of explain that there are nuclear bombs, but there is also nuclear energy. And right now on many energy grids, we have nuclear fission power. So nuclear fission is breaking apart atoms, but nuclear fusion is merging them together. And merging them together is unfortunately a lot harder to do than breaking them apart, but it also produces significantly more energy. So it's something that scientists have been chasing after for a couple of decades. Nobody's quite cracked it. We know how to do the physics of a fusion reaction, so we know how to physically fuse different atoms and molecules, but we don't exactly know how to build a reactor or a power plant that can do this fusing reaction sustainably over a long period of time and capture that energy. That's kind of a challenge right now. So that's the field that I'm working in. I started working in that field during my DPhil or PhD. Gladys and I worked in the same lab, though you might be wondering, like, Gladys didn't do nuclear, so why is she in the same lab? Our supervisor had a lot of different research interests, and one of his interests was in fusion. So when I joined the lab, he had most of his students, maybe 90% were working on more aerospace projects, and then he had a small subset of us that were doing nuclear projects, specifically nuclear fusion projects. So that was my first introduction to nuclear fusion, and I was working with a startup company alongside the University of Oxford to try to understand some of the challenges that we have we call it plasma facing surface of a nuclear fusion machine. So one of the big challenges with fusion is that it is very hot. It is incredibly hot. So the fusion reactor that you might be the most familiar with is the sun. The sun is one big fusion reactor constantly fusing hydrogen. And on Earth, if you want to make a fusion reactor or a fusion power plant, you have to reach temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees Celsius. So that poses some very significant material challenges because it's hard to find a material that can hold in those reactions for a long period of time without melting or cracking or having some other issues. So my PhD was kind of looking into some of those material challenges and how we could use possibly liquid metals rather than solid metals to cover the inside of a nuclear fusion machine or reactor. Now I've finally finished the DPhil, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. It was a long journey. Finished in July-ish of last year. Took about a month off and then started working in the same field, but for a small company called Fission Advisory Services. So Fission Advisory Services it's a newer company, and it's a company that basically focuses on breaking down all of the information that we have in the fusion sector for different clients. So that could be governments, could be investors, could be other science organizations. There's a lot of information in the fusion sector, and so much is changing all of the time. Currently, there's 56 private fusion companies, and there's a lot of labs that are trying to pursue fusion. So we're basically like a large company that puts all that information together and packages it in a way that people can understand whether they're in the field or out of the field.
I wanted to know, I think you enjoyed that a lot because I know you like it's more of a consulting role.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk more about, say, I don't know, like on a day-to-day basis, because I imagine like days do differ, but generally on a day-to-day basis, what do you do? And then if you can highlight, it's just been a few months, but if you can highlight one challenge that you find in the role, and also maybe one thing that is exciting. Maybe I saw that you traveled to UAE recently. I wonder if that is one of the highlights or one of the exciting things about the job. Yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so when I first was introduced to the field of fusion, I was entering as a researcher. And something that I think people don't really know much about the scientific field before they get into it is that you can be a researcher, but there's also other ways to be engaged in science other than being a day-to-day researcher in the lab, finding new discoveries, etc. And while I was doing my DPhil, I realized that I really enjoyed writing about science and I enjoyed talking about science, but I didn't necessarily enjoy working in the lab and, performing experiments or anything like that. So when I was thinking about opportunities post-graduation, I wanted to look for a role that would allow me to do more science writing or science communication and kind of bridge the gap between what the scientists know and what the general public knows about nuclear fusion. Because like as we started off with, most people don't know much about fusion because a lot of that information is kind of held within the national labs or the public and private companies that are pursuing fusion. And there's not many people who have understanding of what's happening in the fusion field and also are able to write about it in a way that is accessible to the public and also to people who need to know that information, like governments or investors or other people. So that's kind of like why I was really excited to kind of get into this role. So on the day-to-day, my title is an analyst, so I'm an analyst at this company. And on the day-to-day, we have several different projects that we work on with different clients. And typically our clients are looking for either one or a couple of pieces of information about the field. So for example, one project that we worked on recently, which is publicly available online, is a report that was commissioned by Amazon Web Services. So Amazon Web Services provides a lot of cloud computing for research organizations and private companies in the field of fusion and also like in general for many different clients. And we're curious about how fusion and AI related essentially. So we know right now that in the field of fusion, a lot of researchers are using artificial intelligence and high performance computing to accelerate the pace of discovery within the field. But in the future, fusion has the ability or it has the potential to start to power some of these large data centers that are running these, simulations and all of the cloud computing. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship between fusion and AI. Right now, AI is kind of pushing forward fusion, but in the future, in the next couple of decades, fusion could really help to power and solve some of these challenges we have within the high performance computing and artificial intelligence sector. So that was one of the reports we worked on. And essentially what I would do during that time was I would spend a lot of time researching and reading papers about how different labs were using artificial intelligence, how different companies were using artificial intelligence. We also did a lot of interviews with companies and national labs, and I did most of the interviews for that report. So I would go through and talk to researchers and other people from these organizations to understand how they're using AI, how they think they'll use AI in the next couple of decades, any ideas that they have about that, and kind of synthesizing that information into a report that is now publicly available on the Clean Air Task Force website. So that's an example of a kind of report that we might generate and what I might be doing on a day-to-day. It might be reading papers, I might be writing. I spend a lot of time writing. So you do some research, you do like a literature review, you write up whatever information you need, you send it to reviewers, and then kind of keep iterating like that. Another example of what I might do is we spend a lot of time also like looking out for new contracts. So Gladys mentioned last month I was in the UAE. I was there for a work trip. So we are looking to see how the UAE can more or better invest in fusion. So how they could open up possibly labs or increase investment in fusion. So we were there giving several talks about, what is fusion, what information do we have now about the fusion industry, how is it growing, et cetera, to some key stakeholders there to kind of get their mind thinking about fusion. They have a really strong track record with fission, so it shows that they'd possibly be quite interested in fusion. And companies like mine are quite useful for governments and labs that are thinking about, changing gears and starting to move into fusion, because we have a lot of information about the field. So we can serve as a starting point to help organizations understand what are the challenges that are remaining in the fusion field, what are the opportunities, and where they could start. So you asked about some of the challenges and then I guess some of the exciting parts. So a big challenge in the field is that there is so much information in the field, and I have a background in chemical engineering, but I'm not a physicist, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a computer scientist. So even when writing the fusion and AI report, I had to, do a lot of research on my own to increase my understanding of, the intricacies of artificial intelligence and kind of get up to speed with that terminology, because I am not an artificial intelligence specialist. So for a lot of these reports, I have to spend a lot of time trying to kind of get to grips with whatever field that we're writing that report on. And, I have a general understanding of the field and et cetera, but you do have to kind of be very agile and very, I guess, willing to dive into new fields or fields that you're less familiar with. Which is exciting, but then also it's tough. Like, you have to really be willing to kind of bridge that learning gap for yourself. And I think having that flexibility is really useful in a field like communication or, writing or advising or consulting, because you're essentially trying to explain this information to, sometimes your clients have the background, but sometimes they don't. And so if you can teach yourself whatever it is that needs to be explained, then it's much easier for you to teach it to somebody else. So it's useful for me. It's hard, but then once you figured it out, then you can much easily explain that to others. And then I guess the exciting aspects of the field or my job are that I work for a startup, so the company is quite small. I'm actually the only full-time employee. We have some part-time employees and some interns. And that means there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what I do from day to day and also what contracts we secure. So if I have an interest in a certain aspect of fusion, or if I want to work with certain clients, then I can push that and I can go out and look for contracts in that area. And that's a really awesome opportunity, especially as a younger person who's, just finished her PhD. It's, I think, maybe a bit rare to be able to have so much opportunity to kind of be free and kind of think, what is it that you want to do within the field? Like, what companies do you want to work with? What governments do you want to work with? What contracts do you want to do? And kind of really go out and get them and learn about the process of, finding new clients and all of the timeline that goes from finding a client to actually writing the report. So that's definitely the most interesting part. I think from this job, I've learned way more, I think, than I would have if I had taken maybe a more traditional route as like a scientist or a researcher or something like that. I've learned about business, learned about, how to interact with clients, and also learned how to write some really cool reports.
Good. Wow, it sounds exciting. And I think when we had that conversation, I have a feeling that you really enjoyed this. And I have a follow-up question, and I don't know if you're open to sharing it. And I'm asking this question mostly for the PhD students who are about to complete their PhDs and they are conflicted. Do I stay in academia? Or maybe they've done postdoc. I was a postdoc at some point. And yeah. I remember just being so conflicted. Do I remain in academia and be an assistant professor and be a professor? Or do I veer out? But then also, like, all this research and all this data and all these skills that I've gotten from the lab, will I lose that? When you were making the decision, because I know I think from another interview you had mentioned that at some point you were entertaining the idea of becoming a professor. So when you completed your PhD, how did you make that decision not to, or yeah, how did you, I don't know, like, why did you choose not to remain in academia and be a professor and prefer this other avenue, which still is amazing? And thank you for highlighting that we actually do not have to remain in academia after PhD. There are so many routes. But yeah, for your own, just your own reflections and your own thoughts around that.
Yeah. So one thing that I kind of discovered about myself during the PhD is that I don't like working on the same thing for a long period of time. And that's one of the challenges that I have with academia and the research environment. Often you're working on one problem for years, maybe even your whole life, depending on how long you decide to stay in academia and if you decide to change projects. And for some people that works really well. I find, at least in our lab, there were a lot of people who were really passionate about the one piece of research that they were working on, and that kept them going from day to day despite the ups and downs of research. And that's just not me. And it took me my PhD to kind of realize that. So then I was sort of trying to think, what other ways can I use this degree in a way that I'm still in the field of fusion, because I like the field, but something that is a bit more maybe quick paced or shorter turnovers in terms of projects, so that I'm getting exposed to many different projects. And also, you're not going to like every project. So if I don't like a project, I'm only on it for a couple of months and then I can move on to a different project. And that's more of how I prefer to operate. So I still love teaching, and I still kind of think about teaching from time to time. But something you'll find about teaching is that many people who are doing teaching at the university level are doing other things on the side, because it's not really a full-time job. So typically they'll be doing research and then they teach during the terms. In the UK, terms are only eight weeks, and there's 3 of them, at least at Oxford. So for most of the year, you're not teaching. So you have to find something else to fill your time. So in the future, I might want to consider teaching, but I would still need something else kind of on the day-to-day to pay my bills and, to kind of keep my mind active. So I started to think about jobs that would be a bit more people-facing, and also something that would maybe involve more like writing and the things that I like. So there was one day during my PhD, I sat down and I really tried to think about what are the aspects that I don't like about my PhD and what are the aspects that I like. Because at that point, there were a lot of things I didn't like, and it's kind of easy to focus on like what you don't like about something, but there's usually at least 1 or 2 things that you actually enjoy. And for me, that was the writing, and it was the speaking to people outside of the field about what I was doing. So I started to think about what roles I could do that would have more of a focus on the aspects that I did like and less of a focus on the aspects that I didn't like. And one of the interesting things about the field of fusion is that it's a relatively newer field. People have been working on fusion since the 60s or maybe 50s, but a lot of companies that are in the field are very new. And that means that a lot of the jobs are new, like nobody's ever done it before. So part of my job search involved just talking to a lot of people in the field and asking them, like, this is what I like doing, are there jobs that would let me do something like that? And that's tricky. It's definitely tricky being in a field where things are not defined. It's not a very established field. There is a lot of like unknown. But eventually I met the person that I work with now. His name is Simon Woodruff. I actually met him during my PhD. He was the person who built one of the magnets that I needed for my experiments. I was talking to him about finishing my PhD soon, and like, I'm not really sure what I want to do, but I don't want to do research traditionally, but I like writing and communication. And he said, oh, well, actually, there's a company that's, coming up that, I'm part of the team of spinning it out. Or building the company out. Would you be interested in that? And that's how I ended up in this job. So I guess it's a less traditional kind of route than like finding a job online and then applying for it. But I think in this day and age, I think a lot of jobs kind of come across by having conversations with people and explaining what you like, and then sometimes there's a match between what you like and what they need, and that works out really well.
I really love that, and I feel like you actually used your PhD time really well. I know it was challenging, and we'll talk about it, but the fact that you discovered a lot about yourself during that time, something that I don't even remember doing a lot, but like you intentionally wrote down things that you like and you dislike about the job, and then you went out of your way to talk to people, which I think I imagine that would be a lesson to the grad students, to chat with people and actively mention what you like to do and what you're looking forward to doing after PhD. That is amazing, Naomi. Before we go to grad school journey, I want you to mention just what do you see as like major trends that would be happening in nuclear fusion in the next, say, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so as I said, the field has changed quite significantly in the last couple of years, and especially in the private sector, there's been a huge spike in investment. So maybe 10 years ago, the number of private companies was quite small. And many countries didn't have any private fusion industry. And now there's 56, and they're kind of placed 56 private companies. They're placed all over the world. And the amount of money that the industry is I guess bringing in is growing exponentially. Like, it's skyrocketing. And one of the reasons for this skyrocket is that we're getting closer and closer to being able to actually build a fusion power plant and generate electricity from it. So there was like a big announcement a couple of years ago at one of the labs in the US. They do a kind of fusion called laser fusion or inertial confinement fusion. And they were able to essentially have more energy come out than what they put in. So that wasn't considering all of the like electrical equipment and everything that they need to like put into the laser to produce the fusion reactor. But at a small scale, they were able to produce more electricity than they put in. And that's huge for the field. That's really big. And that got a lot of people really excited about fusion and also garnered a lot of interest from outside fields into the field of fusion. So in the next couple of years, several private companies are planning to produce a machine that will produce more energy than it puts in, looking at the overall plant balance. So thinking about all the electricity that they put into their lasers or their magnets or whatever they use to do their fusion, all that electricity, calculating all of that, and then calculating what comes out of the fusion reactor is going to be a net positive. And that's really exciting for the field, especially for people who've been in the field for decades and have been like kind of waiting for this day for quite a long time. So the momentum in the field is kind of shifting from the public lab space of, trying to understand the fundamentals to now there are people who are actually putting money behind this idea and trying to actually make it happen. And that's really quite exciting. So in the next couple of years, I think you're going to be seeing a lot more news articles in, general news sources about what's happening in the field and new advances from the private and the public sector. And I think you're also going to see a lot of people just beginning to be more interested in the field who are not actually in fusion. So we're seeing a lot of people from other fields like computer science or even nuclear fission or, other fields kind of looking and seeing, oh, okay, I'm working in my field, but I can actually apply what I'm doing to this really exciting challenge that is happening right now. And there's a lot of jobs right now in the fusion sector because, there's not a lot of people who know so much about fusion. So it can be the amount of people who are in the field is quite small compared to the number of jobs that we have and the number of jobs that are coming up. So I think it's going to be something that's kind of like on the tip of everyone's tongue in the next couple of years.
We'll take a pause there, and I'm sure I'll have you back again in a couple of months or a couple of years to talk about all these advancements and exciting things that are happening. Yes, but for now, let's just pause here and talk about transition to graduate school. And I know you have a lot to talk about graduate school. So for someone who is beginning their graduate journey, their PhD especially, reflect back to when you started, all the challenges along the way, all the opportunities, just anything in between, and just summarize for us your graduate school journey. Where did you do your graduate school? What were you researching? Any tips, pieces of advice, things you wish you had known before you started the journey?
Yeah. So Gladys and I were actually in the same PhD program. I completed my DPhil or PhD in engineering science from the University of Oxford, and I finished that last year. But I started in 2018, which is very uncommon. Typically, DPhils at Oxford are about 3 or 4 years. But for a number of reasons, my DPhil took almost 6 years. So in 2018, when I started, I was also like Gladys in that I hadn't done a master's degree. So I came straight from my undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, which I did in the States at the University of Maryland. I applied for the Rhodes Scholarship. I got it. I was the first one from my university to get it. I was really excited. Came overseas. It was my first time really being outside of where I grew up for a long period of time, if that makes sense. So where I went to university for my bachelor's was actually down the street from where I went to elementary school. You could walk between the places if you wanted to. So I had lived always in a very comfortable space. Like I knew a lot of people at my university. It's the same people who I went to high school with and went to middle school with and went to elementary school with. So now moving across the ocean and being somewhere where I knew absolutely no one that's a big shock in and of itself. And then now I'm working in Fusion and I have no background in Fusion. That's a big shock. And I'm kind of working in a different educational system than what I grew up in, and that's another sort of big shock. So when I first started in the lab, I was very happy that I found kind of a couple of people that I really connected with. So Gladys was one of them, and also Lucy, who had started off with me, and Saria. We all kind of started off and were supporting each other. I think that's something that is really, really essential when you first start your PhD or your master's or whatever degree program, finding support system, because there's going to be a lot of challenges that you run into, and there's going to be times where you want to bounce ideas off of people and try to understand what to do, essentially. And being able to talk to people really helps. And a good example of that actually came from, I don't know if it was from you, Gladys, or from Lucy, but one thing I noticed when I first started was that it was very difficult to figure out times to meet with my supervisor because he had a lot of students. And so I think this might have been you, Gladys. I was trying to find time in his calendar and I couldn't. And someone recommended to me that I should try to meet with him early in the morning, like 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. because that's when no other students are in the lab, so he's not distracted and he's typically there. So that's when you would have, kind of undivided attention from the supervisor. And that's something I carried throughout my DPhil, and I shared that with other students whenever they kind of ran into challenges and they needed to find time with our supervisor. That's something I wouldn't have even thought of if I hadn't spoken to people in the lab and kind of worked that out. And that helped me immensely. So yeah, I've started my DPhil in this new field. So I'm reading up on the field. I'm going to summer schools. I found summer schools to be quite helpful as a way to increase my knowledge of the field. It's kind of like taking all the things you'd learn in a master's and kind of condensing it into a couple of weeks. And sometimes your lab will have funding for that kind of thing. So luckily our lab had funding for me to go to some summer schools. So I would go for a couple of weeks to a university that had these condensed courses and try to really understand what's going on. I met people in the field and was able to ask questions and kind of see firsthand what it is that I would be working on. So that was most of my kind of first year of my DPhil. And then the second year of my DPhil is where I really started to kind of dig into my research project. One thing that was a bit unique about my project was that I was working on it essentially alone. So with a PhD, you can sometimes have a project where there are many people working on the project with you. You'll have your own project, but you'll have kind of other people to bounce ideas off of because they're working on maybe the same overall concept, but they have a different approach to it. So maybe they're trying to optimize some kind of blade and you want to try this material, but they want to try that material. So you have the same general concept of just different approaches and you can bounce ideas. But because our lab didn't have many people working in Fusion and nobody else was working on a project like mine, it was kind of like a different experience than some of the other people that were working in the lab. And so with that, I honestly found some challenges because I didn't have many people to kind of bounce ideas off of, and I had to be creative about making sure that I found networks that could help me to make sure that my research was progressing along. And that's where the company that I worked with, Tokamak Energy, they were really helpful. They provided, I had a mentor there, Peter Buxton, and he was very, very useful in helping me to really make sure that my project, one, made sense, and two, could be done in a reasonable timeline and all of that. Third year was COVID. And I think at that point, Gladys had just escaped the lab. So she was very lucky in that sense. But this is when my research was about to really start taking form, because essentially my project was building an experiment at the University of Oxford. And that means I had to buy all of this new equipment and kind of design everything. And most of my equipment was meant to arrive in 2020. So when 2020 happened, COVID happened, we had to kind of put a brake on a lot of my research project progress and shift gears. So that took a couple of months where I wasn't sure if I would be able to, like, when I'd be able to go back into the lab, because the lab was shut. I had to kind of figure out what I would do if I couldn't go back into the lab, what way I could keep progressing my research without being in the lab, because my research was completely experimental at the time. And that was sort of a big challenge, and really had to rely on like speaking to people in my networks, and also just really thinking about where my priorities were, and how long I was willing to dedicate to this DPhil, because at that point you can leave. Nobody is holding your hand and saying you have to stay there. You can leave and move on if you want to. So that was kind of a decision that had to be made. And towards the end of 2020, I decided to shift gears for my project and kind of make something that could be done regardless of the pandemic situation. So that is part of the reason why it ended up taking me almost 6 years to finish my DPhil, because at the end of 2020, I basically scrapped my old project and decided to start up a new project. And that wasn't straightforward either. Had to kind of figure out how I could reuse the equipment that I'd already purchased for this other project, and kind of reconfigure things. And yeah, there were very, very dark moments, hard times where I thought, I don't know if I'm going to finish this DPhil. Like, where's the end? There's no end in sight. And last year, or 2023 actually, because it's 2025 now, I had to make a decision to have essentially like a go, no go date. And that was a date that I had decided in my mind where if I don't have enough for my DPhil by now, I just have to move on. So I have to either continue with a master's or, just kind of move on and find a job. And I think as someone who never failed anything really in her life, it was very challenging, very, very challenging to kind of come to the conclusion that I can continue doing this and, I can stay here for an indefinite period of time. Or I can do what works best for me, even if it might not look the best from the outside, or it might, draw questions from my friends or family. And I talked with Gladys a lot about this, talked with Lucy, talked with other people, and kind of set that date for myself. This is the date. If I don't have my results from the lab experiments, then I'm just going to have to move on. And yeah, long story short, I had not what I wanted by that date, but I had something. So I wrote up that something and put it together and really tried to put a cohesive story about what I had done. And I had to kind of put my perfectionism aside. I think a lot of people who get to the PhD level might be perfectionists, and they want everything to kind of be perfect. They want their results to be perfect. They want to have all their results, and their supervisors might also want them to have the maximum possible amount of results so that there's no way that they could possibly, fail or anything like that. But you have to do what works for you, and I needed to get out of there. So I took what I had, I put it together. I worked with several different researchers from different universities too, just to make sure that I could figure out how to best package what I had, because what I had was useful. It might not have been what I wanted to have, but it was useful, and it could be packaged in a way that could get me to the finish line. So I took what I had, I wrote it up, really spent a lot of time thinking about how to write it up in a way that was reasonable and worked well for me, and defended, and sort of now I'm here.
Wow. Yeah, your story. I'm because you like writing. I would want you to write it in form of a book at some point, because we've been in conversation, but you have a very interesting graduate school journey, a journey of discovering yourself, and a journey of resilience. Whenever I think of resilience, I think about you, because you went through a lot. Like you mentioned, the COVID, the ups and downs. You were pretty much the first person in the lab doing nuclear fusion, I think, as a PhD student, the only one doing the fusion when you started. And then like, yeah, you just you went through a lot. I feel like I had a softer landing because when I started, I was part of a smaller team. There were already guys doing whatever I was researching, and I didn't even have to start a new experimental setup because there was someone who had already set it up, and I kind of just shifted a little, edited things, and I was good to start collecting data. And it was very easy for me to go through the whole process. Almost, yeah, I didn't feel like I feel like I didn't go through a lot of challenges, at least to the magnitude that you did. So it's very commendable graduate school journey. Yeah. Yeah. Now, what do you now? You are a few months out of the PhD thing. What is one thing you wish you had been told? I know you reached out to me when you were starting your PhD. You were planning to join our lab, and to be honest, I think I didn't tell you. I didn't paint the whole picture, but again, I was trying not to be biased and what's the name? Bring out my own negative experiences to taint your experience. And so I remember being just overly positive about it. But now for a student who is planning to start a PhD journey, and I feel like particularly places like Oxford, where even in our lab where diversity wasn't a thing, when I was there before you joined, I was the only Black woman there. And also, I think that social aspect of things, it does affect your experience as a PhD student. Yeah. And I feel like for a long time, I did not have a language to speak about it because I came from Kenya where race and whatever was not a thing. And then I found myself in a place where now was an intersection of race and gender. And it was very difficult for me to talk about it. And so anyway, long story short is that I think when you reached out, I was overly positive about the entire process. But yeah, for any student who is planning to start a PhD, we can even just talk to those who are going to start their PhDs at Oxford or places like Oxford. What is one thing you wish you had been told, or you wish I had told you?
Yeah, I think one thing that would be really important for me, not only to be told, but to really ingest and understand, is that everyone's journey is different, and you really shouldn't compare your journey to anyone else's. I think that was one of my biggest challenges when I first started, because I didn't really understand that everyone had truly a different process. Like, you were all doing a PhD, but coming from undergrad, everyone is doing the same thing. You're all taking the same classes, you're taking the same exam. So whatever grade or output you have is based on the same kind of variables. Like, you all took same homework assignments, etc., and you decided to do, with that, whatever you decided. And then you had your output of your grades. So coming into the DPhil, it's totally different. You have the same exam in theory, like you have the same structure of exam, but the questions you're asked are different, and the project that you're working on is different, and the supervisor you have is different. And, there's so many different variables that kind of change from person to person. So in my first year, I really struggled with comparing what I was doing and what my PhD looked like to others. And that caused me a lot of kind of unnecessary stress and sleepless nights, to be honest. I would compare my project to others. So there were some students who were already collecting data in the first year. And in the first year, I didn't even have an experiment because it had to be built. So I was years away from having any data collection. And in the first exam that we have at Oxford, it's called the transfer of status. You have to write a report about what you've done so far and what you plan to do for the next couple of years to reach the deadline that you have for your final submission. And I remember comparing my report to my peers because at the time, I think we all used to do our presentations in the same place. Well, anyways, you knew what everyone else was doing. And I would see some of my colleagues go up and say, I have these results from my computational simulations, and I collected this data last month, and it looks like this and that. And my presentation looked very different because my project was very different. And I felt very insecure about that, because I didn't like really conceptualize that everyone's journey is different. And that expanded to more than just me in the research space. It also expanded to like social life. At Oxford, you'll meet a lot of very ambitious people, and everyone likes to spend their free time in a different way. And I think it can be very easy to compare the structure of your week to the structure of other people's weeks who maybe might, some people might be really into sports, so a lot of their time is spent, going to games and etc. And you might be thinking, should I be doing sports? Like, should I be engaged in XYZ? And yeah, it's very easy to compare yourself to other people at Oxford. People like to talk about themselves. They like to, kind of indirectly compare, like, oh, what are you doing over the weekend? What are you doing? What are you doing? And it can be looked down upon to do self-care activities like rest or, read a book or something like that. That can be kind of like downplayed compared to all of the different opportunities you have at Oxford, because you're at Oxford, you should be going to lectures, you should be networking, you should be, doing all of these different things. So it took me a while to come to the point where I had to really sit down and think, what do I like to do? What do I enjoy? What do I need? And come to terms with the idea that might look different than, what my classmates might like to do or how they structure their time. And another way that this kind of played out was actually in terms of time management. So COVID kind of helped with this, but when I first joined the lab, most people would come in from like 9 to maybe 5 or 6, whatever time. And then COVID rolled around, people were working remotely, so you didn't really know when people were working. And after COVID, we kind of stuck with that schedule. Some people would never come in. Some people would come in when every day, kind of depended. But nobody could really see like when you were working because people were working from home. And I think in that time after COVID, I really found a lot of freedom to think, when do I like working? And just working at those times and not feeling any judgment about, not having maybe the traditional work schedule. And I think Gladys also had a very untraditional work schedule. She would usually maybe work on the weekends and then maybe take Monday off or, whatever. And you have the freedom to do that as a DPhil student or a PhD student. And I think you should take advantage of that. But that involves you really understanding yourself and seeing, when do you work best? How many hours works best for you? Because maybe if you work for 12 hours a day, you become inefficient and it's just useless for you to be working for that long. Some people can be very efficient and they work for 5 hours and they get everything done and then they can, do other things with their day. And that's just up to you. So you have to decide, what is it that I need to get done? What's the time frame that works for me? What do I want to do with my free time? All of those things. And it's hard, but once you kind of figure that out, you can kind of breathe a bit easier and feel a lot less stressed. So I wish I had figured that out a lot earlier.
Because even myself, I think everyone does. I don't know. And also because we came from undergrad, and I think there is just a natural tendency to always gauge, where are your colleagues? Am I at par?
Exactly.
But then, I remember
you can't do that at a DPhil.
I had a lot of pressure. When I started as well. I was like, people are leaving the lab at 6. And even if I didn't have anything to do, I would just like stretch my time until 6, just so that I don't leave early and all that. You are very right. I 100% agree with knowing that the journeys are different, and also where we came from are different, and also where we are heading to are different. Like even in terms of publishing papers, right? I had a lot of pressure because I think my colleagues were already publishing papers. I did not have a paper published until I think in my 3rd year or wherever. But then again, I think they were super intentional. I had one colleague who was super intentional about going to academia, and so the more papers you have, the better for you. And so realizing that we come from different places, we are heading different places, we have different lives. It takes time to know, but thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, definitely.
You did mention that you studied, or you are a Rhodes Scholar from the US. I understand that Rhodes Scholarship in the US is super competitive. So I would want you to touch on that. What does it mean to be a Rhodes Scholar, or what does it mean, and especially for you? at least for you, and maybe tips, and super commendable actually that you were the first Rhodes Scholar from your
Thank you.
institution. So maybe
Thank you.
speak to especially students in the US, maybe who are in non-Ivy Leagues or non-big universities, and they desire to apply for Rhodes Scholarship. From your own experiences, like talk to them.
Yeah. So I found out about the Rhodes Scholarship in my first year of undergraduate, and in the States, usually your undergraduate degree is about 4 years. So in that first year, I was approached by someone who was running the honors college that we had at the I was at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, so a public university in Maryland. And they said, there's this scholarship called the Rhodes Scholarship. I think you might be a good candidate. I don't know how he figured that out by that point, but he said, you should, read into it and think about it. And then, closer to when you finish, we can maybe talk more and see how you could apply. So I think I'd heard about it before, because in the States, the Rhodes Scholarship is a very big deal. It's one of probably the most prestigious scholarships in the whole country. And I had maybe heard glimpses of, maybe heard this person is a Rhodes Scholar or that it's prestigious or something like that, but I didn't know so much about it. So that night I went and looked online and Googled, Rhodes Scholar, saw the website, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's no way I could do something like that. The people who are selected for these scholarships, they're not only academically talented, but they have, some of them are Olympic athletes, or, they've started companies that are now valuated at millions of dollars. And I thought, I'm a good student, but I don't know that I have all the other kind of aspects that are needed for the scholarship. So I just kind of kept it in the back of my mind and then continued on with school. And then typically for the Rhodes Scholarship in the States, you apply in your final year around September. So my 4th year of undergrad, I was applying. Some people apply after they finish undergrad as well. So in my 4th year, I sat down, I was thinking, okay, I want to go to graduate school, and it's either I go to graduate school in the States or I go abroad. And I really liked the idea of going abroad. As I said before, I'd lived in the same place my whole life, and I was kind of itching to see other places, whether it be other places in the US or other places in the world. And the Rhodes Scholarship seemed like a really good opportunity to do that. But there's also other scholarships. So I applied to pretty much every scholarship I could find that would let me go to do my master's or PhD in the UK. So I, again, look at this application for the Rhodes Scholarship, and I'm kind of looking through what I need. And the process is definitely very rigorous in the States. So I think I needed about 7 letters of recommendation, which that honestly might have been the hardest part, because if you don't go to a very large university, then you don't have many professors that teach you. So I had kind of the same professors that would teach multiple courses, because the school I went to it wasn't a small school, but it wasn't a huge school. So pretty much every professor that I had in my department, I had to ask for a letter of recommendation, which means I had to have a good relationship with them. So that was kind of one aspect of it that can kind of make or break your application. If you don't have 7 backers, then your application is pretty doomed. And then the application itself involved writing an essay. It was just one essay. It was very open-ended. It was something about what are your plans in the future? They just wanted to know basically what your ambitions are in life. And it was super open-ended. And applications in the States for research, for graduate school scholarships, and also for the programs are usually very specific. They want to know, what research do you want to do? Or, give me an example of a leadership position you had in undergrad or whatever. But this scholarship was very open-ended. Just here's 1 page or 2 pages or whatever. Just tell me, how you want to change the world or whatever. So I spent most of the summer before my undergraduate final year just looking at that question and trying to think of how I could answer it. And actually, the week before the application was due, I changed the entire essay completely. It just scrapped what I had and then rewrote it. Because it was just so open-ended, and I like writing, so I have so many different drafts of the essay, and I was kind of just trying to think which one felt most authentic to me. And something that I always try to do whenever I write is that I always try to write with empathy. So whenever I'm writing, I try to put myself in the shoes of whoever's going to be reading it. And I know for these kind of for this kind of application, I know who's going to be reading. It's going to be other Rhodes Scholars from, you know, alumni of the program, and they're going to be reading probably like 1,000 essays, or I don't know how many essays each of them read, maybe 100 or 50 or something, and many of them are going to look the exact same. So I decided that I wasn't going to. Actually, you're not allowed to seek help for the essay. In the States, you have to kind of, I think, sign something that says you can't seek help. But there's essays available online and things like that. So some people decide to look at the sample essays and kind of base what they write off of that. But I decided that I didn't want to do anything like that. I just wanted to write what I thought made sense and what seemed authentic to me. And I thought that would be the best way for me to kind of show off who I am and what I care about, but also write it in a way that's interesting to the person who is going to be reading it, because I have no idea what everyone else is writing, and it's very unlikely that it's going to be similar to what I'm writing, because I'm just writing from a blank canvas. So the application was due in October. I needed the letters of recommendation. I needed my essay and the transcript. And at that point, several people from my university had gotten to the interview stage, but they hadn't received the scholarship. So I spoke to the people from my university who had gone to the interview stage, and they were giving me some tips on the interview. And my university was very helpful at that stage. That we did a mock interview, and we had like an etiquette course, because, you know, these are things you probably don't think about, but if you're a judge and there are, 14 applicants for a scholarship and everyone is academically talented, small things like etiquette can have a really big impact. If somebody is kind of eating things in a way that is not pleasant to watch, that can be off-putting, and that can just kind of put a bad feeling into that assessor, and that can be the end of that scholarship for you. So we had some training about things like that. I submitted my application, found out a few weeks later that I received an interview, was super nervous about the interview, went in. So in the States, the interview is a 2-day process. So the first day you have like a cocktail hour. So we have like drinks and canapes, and you eat and drink and get to talk with the different interviewers that you'll meet with the next day, and also the different applicants. So there's 14, I believe, that are chosen from each district. I don't know how many districts there are in the States, but my district was anyone who went to university in Maryland or DC or lives in Maryland or DC. So they might be people who go to, say, Harvard and Boston, but they live originally in Maryland, so they would be eligible for my region. And I learned that big schools like Harvard, they have kind of these very they figured out these processes of how they can make sure that, like, for example, Massachusetts doesn't only have like 50 people applying from Harvard. So they kind of try to spread out, like, you're from Harvard, but you live in Hawaii, so let's have you apply for Hawaii. There's lots of kind of things that go into that. But from a small school like mine, I mean, I was the only person who was interested in applying, so it was just kind of like, very straightforward from there. So one challenge actually I ran into that I think is unique from applying from a school that didn't have a Rhodes Scholar in the past is that there was some challenges that I ran into in terms of trying to apply to the Rhodes Scholarship and also applying to other scholarships due to, I think, like maybe lack of knowledge, institutional knowledge. So when I told the people at the university that I wanted to apply for this scholarship, you have to receive an endorsement from your university. You can't just apply for the Rhodes Scholarship in the States. You have to have your university say, we're putting forth this person. And so at the time, actually, the university didn't know that you could apply for, say, Rhodes and Marshall, which is another very competitive scholarship, and Gates Cambridge. They didn't know that you could apply for all of them as one person. They kind of thought that you had to, like, spread out who could apply for what. And that's just like institutional knowledge. They just sort of didn't know. So when I told them I wanted to apply for all of them, they were like, we don't know if you could do that. Like, maybe you should just, apply for one, like just pick one and then we'll support that. And I was like, no, like I want to maximize my chances of applying. If somebody else comes up who's a better applicant for some of them, then, you can pick them over me. That's fine, because they don't want to put too many people forward for these scholarships. And usually it's only about one per university, unless it's like a big university. So I said, okay, if you find someone else who's a better candidate for one of these, then put them forth. But otherwise, I think I should be considered for all of the scholarships if I want to apply for all of the scholarships. So that was, I think, one of the maybe unique challenges of applying from a university that didn't have a scholar in the past. But eventually they were like, okay, you can apply for them. So I applied for all of them. Went for the Rhodes interview, had the cocktail dinner the night of, it was a Friday night. One tip I would give actually is that I came 15 minutes early to the cocktail dinner. And I was actually the first potential scholar to arrive. So all of the judges were there and it was just me. So I was able to meet all of them like on my own. So I walked in confidently. I said, "Hi, I'm Naomi." And I kind of had all their attention for 15 minutes before everyone else started to trickle in. And that I think was really helpful for me to kind of make sure that I spoke with everyone, because I was able to do that very quickly at the beginning, rather than if you come in with everyone else, it can be really hard to make sure that you hit everyone that you need to talk to throughout that hour or two. So that's, I guess, a little tip. At the end of the cocktail dinner, we pick numbers from a hat to determine who does interviews first. So I think I was number 2 or 3 or something. I was pretty early on. Came in the next day, had my interview, and then what else is unique to the US is that after your interviews, you have to stay in the building and actually in a room with the other potential scholars. So all 14 of us were in one room together while the judges deliberated and tried to figure out who they were going to select. So that process can take hours and hours and hours. Luckily, my time around, it wasn't too long. I think it took maybe 2 or 3 hours, but it could take much longer. But you're in a room with snacks and all those things. You're just kind of like hanging out and talking with the other people who are being interviewed. And I actually brought a pack of Uno because I knew I'd be very nervous. So I wanted to bring like a little game that I could maybe play with whoever was interested in playing, because I knew I didn't like talking to the other candidates after an interview. Like I don't like talking to people after like doing something like that, if that makes sense. Like I don't like comparing notes. Some people like to ask like, oh, what question did they ask you? Or, you know, and that makes me very nervous, especially if I can't change anything at this point. Like, it's just up to them. So I knew that about myself. So I decided to bring like a game so that whoever I was talking to, like, we could just play the game and like talk about other things. Like that would really calm my nerves. So me and a group of people, we played Uno, and then a couple of hours later, the judges come out and say, you know, you were all really great, but we have to pick 2. And they say the names, and then they give everyone like 10 minutes to kind of like say their goodbyes to everyone, and then that's it. I don't agree completely with that process. I think maybe there's a better way to maybe tell people after the fact in their own private space, you know, who's received the scholarship or not. But I'm not in charge of the process, so that's not on me. But that's kind of how that process goes. And then after that, you apply for your program at Oxford, and I'm sure Gladys has kind of gone into all of that. But that was my experience with applying for the scholarship as a person from a university that was kind of less known. I think another thing I'll bring up is with these interviews, I think you need to be prepared when you're, you know, going into interviews, but there's a difference between being prepared and being scripted, and you don't want to come off as scripted. And I think because I didn't have so many practice interviews before, I really just had one. My responses were very genuine in what I was saying. Like, I didn't really know what they were going to ask me. And the questions they asked me are very different from the questions that I prepared, like from my panel, because they also didn't have any experience with the Rhodes Scholarship. So they didn't really know what I was going to be asked. And I think sometimes if you over prepare, or if you're like trying to Google all the possible questions that could be asked and all the answers that you could be asked, your responses can come across as very scripted. And I think these panels of judges can probably figure that out, that you are kind of not being so genuine. So it's okay to say if you don't know an answer to something. During one of my interviews, maybe not Rhodes, probably Marshall, I was asked a question. I was asked a very like lowball question. It was something like, what happened at Fukushima, or like one of these nuclear accidents? It's something I should have known as someone who wanted to go into the field, but, you know, nerves or whatever, I didn't have an answer. So I just told them, you know, I actually don't know exactly what happened, but I could give you my guess based on like what I know about the field. But like, honestly, I don't know. And I felt really embarrassed in that moment, because it's something that you should know, you know, it's something that I should know. But I think just being genuine and saying like, I don't know, like I'm not sure, like, that's not necessarily what I'm looking to be researching in my DPhil or my research. But good question, etc. is a useful thing to do.
Wow, thank you for giving us a brief of your journey, and again, it's super commendable. Do you know if there is anyone from your institution who's gotten after you?
Yeah, so I think maybe not the year after, 2 years after, Sam, another person from my university, received the scholarship. So now there are 2 to my knowledge. Yeah, me and Sam.
Wow, congratulations for opening the door. Okay, because of time, Naomi, but before we end, 2 other questions that I have. If you can just touch briefly about your passion for opening space for especially minorities in STEM, and you've been involved in organizing these amazing, impactful conferences. I think I saw on LinkedIn that you've organized over 13 so far. If you can just speak on that, and then we will be ending after that.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm really, really passionate about bringing more people of color and also people who are just underrepresented in science into the field. And that's something that I like doing in my free time. So when I was living in the States, I was part of the National Society of Black Engineers, or NSBE. And then when I moved to the UK, they have the Association for Black and Minority Engineers, or AFBE. And I like organizing events. I like kind of figuring out ways to like bring people together in a useful way. So when I was in the States, I was the regional vice chairperson for the National Society of Black Engineers. So part of that role was to organize conferences both at the regional level and like local levels, and helping out with the national conferences. And I loved those conferences. They were a great way for students to meet other people in their field and also get access to internships and like meet industry mentors. And I just thought it was a really great way to kind of share information that you might miss depending on how good of a community you had at your university. And I think in terms of bridging the gap between like people of color entering fields like engineering or science, a lot of times we just don't have the information of how to do these things. Like how can you get a scholarship? How can you do well in school, or information like that other communities might have that information more readily available, just because of history. So I really liked organizing those conferences. I liked helping out and forming communities there. So when I moved here to the UK, I realized they don't have NSBE necessarily, but they have their own organization, AFBE, but they'd never had a conference before, like a national conference. So I joined their committee and was kind of advocating for us to have some kind of national conference. Eventually, they decided that they wanted to have one, so I helped out with organizing that, and helped to organize like a competition within the conference called Next Big Idea. So that competition was basically trying to encourage people of color to talk about their research and win some money in the process of talking about their research, or even their business ideas. It didn't have to be research. So I kind of spearheaded that alongside my colleague Dennis, and it was just a really great opportunity to bring people together in the UK in the way that I had done in the US, and kind of expand people's networks, have job opportunities become more readily available, and just really grow the community. So it's something I'm really passionate about. I really enjoy, and I look forward to seeing how that passion kind of evolves in the future.
Incredible work, and keep doing that, Naomi.
Thank you.
Super commendable. In closing, just because of time, I think I saw a clip somewhere on these streets of the internet that at 12 years you wanted to be a doctor. I know you are a doctor, but a different doctor. So if you look back to when you were young, and the journey you've traveled, the detours that have happened. I know when you were young, maybe Rhodes Scholarship was not even in the picture, that you would relocate overseas. So when you look back to when you were young, maybe after, I don't know, high school or starting your undergrad, and the journey you've traveled, I know you're still traveling the journey, but so far, when you look back, what is one lesson that you would say stands out?
Yeah, so when I was 12, I was actually really bad at math and science, which you probably wouldn't guess based on my career trajectory now. So I think I'd be quite shocked to see that I'm in the field of nuclear fusion because my best subjects were always like English and, reading, things like that. But it took a couple of years to kind of increase my abilities in science and math, and now I'm actually pretty good at those fields. But I think one piece of advice that I would give is that don't be discouraged if you're not amazing at something that you want to do. And I think, entrepreneurs are really like, they really grasp that concept. Like they don't have to be the best at something. They just want to try it and then they go for it and then, they can fail and that's fine. But depending on your personality type, sometimes you can be discouraged if you want to, say, become a scientist, but maybe science isn't your best subject or you're not that great at math or anything like that. And then you can compare how you're doing to your classmates who sometimes they're just naturally very good at math or they're like a science whiz. They build experiments in their backyard, things like that. And you can think, there's no way I can be a scientist. I'm not like that. So I think, yeah, my piece of advice would be that it really doesn't matter what you're good at. It's just what you're passionate about, and that will push you further than sometimes even ability, natural ability. If you're really passionate about something and willing to, put in time and effort and work into it, then that is really what matters in the end, and that's what's going to make you happy. So don't be discouraged if you're not naturally good at something or aren't as good as your coworkers or whatever. Some of the best researchers that I've kind of met, they weren't necessarily the best at university. They didn't have the best grades, but they really like research and they're happy to talk about it and they're happy to spend hours in the lab doing it. So really following what you're passionate about is what matters.
Amazing. I will not add anything to that, and I totally agree. So Naomi, just because of time, we will end here. Is there anything we missed to chat about?
I think we've got it all. We've got it all for this time. But thanks so much for having me on. It's been good seeing you. Always a pleasure, and wishing you all the best.
I wish you all the best as well. Thank you, Naomi.
All right.